You blink awake to the faint glow of dawn squeezing through a narrow slit high on the wall. Your head throbs, not from last night's work, but from a half-finished dream of marble halls and silk-draped windows that dissolved when a neighbor stumbled home and slammed her door. You roll over on your straw mattress, half expecting something softer beneath, but the hardwood slats remind you, this is your world now. A tiny cellar room, no wider than a horse's stall, is where you sleep, eat, and work. No windows, no fresh air, only a single oil lamp dangling from a rusted hook, its light flickering across damp stone. Your first decision of the day is purely practical. Try to find that missing wick or risk stumbling in darkness. You grope across the floor, kicking aside yesterday's clay lamp, emptied and broken, and locate a fresh jar of olive oil. With careful hands, you roll out the new wick, thread it through the tiny spindle, and trim the frayed end. The lamp ignites with a hissing whisper, and suddenly the room feels a degree less hostile. Next comes the morning sweep. You grab a rough-hewn broom, twisted twigs bound together with coarse string, and scrape away last night's dust, spilt wine, and the occasional clamshell someone left behind. This chore takes all of 2 minutes, yet feels like an hour. Your stomach growls, reminding you that real work still awaits. A quick glance around confirms the essentials: a small wooden stool, a chipped bronze mirror, a comb carved from animal bone, a little clay jar of rouge, and a pouch of natron. That's it, everything you own. You shrug on a plain wool shift, knotted at one shoulder, and drop to your knees at the foot of your bed. 5 rapid puffs of natron into your palm, just enough to scrub away yesterday's grime without stripping every last drop of oil from your skin. You close your eyes as you rub, pretending it's a moment of luxury. It is not. By now, the roar of the city has started. Somewhere above, a baker hurls loaves through his front window. Somewhere below, rats scuttle through the drains. Your breathing steadies as the cold stone under your knees reminds you of why you must hurry. You splash water, cold, disgusting water, from a chipped jug across your cheeks, trying to wash away the exhaustion. Wine in the mouth? A luxury. You content yourself with rinsing from the public fountain later if you can afford the couple of coppers in vessel rental fees. It's time to prepare your face for display. You settle onto the stool, setting the bronze mirror against the wall. Pale face powder first, chalk drawn from the marble quarries, a thick paste that makes cheeks chalky but hides shadows. Red ochre for lips and cheeks, dabbed sparingly. A little goes a long way, and coin counters in the crowd can smell waste a mile off. Then coal-black eyeliner drawn in a sharp line across your lids, giving you that just-awoken smolder. You practice this sultry half-smile, teeth just barely revealed, lashes lowered, so often that the muscles ache, but you keep at it. Performance is everything. With makeup done, you move to hair. Today you're fortunate. Your favorite wig, made of dyed Gaulish blonde hair, waits in its cloth sack. You tug it on gingerly. Blonde wigs cost more, but draw a bigger crowd. Everyone loves a bit of exotic flair. You tuck your own hair underneath, pinning stray curls with bronze hairpins shaped like little swans. A quick twist of the remaining lock behind your ear, and you're ready to face the forum. The final touch is your toga, short, bright crimson, hemmed just above mid-thigh. The law forbids respectable matrons from wearing togas, but for you it's a uniform. Bold drape over one shoulder, the other arm free, allowing your white linen undergarment to peek through as a tease. You fasten it with a bronze fibula richly scratched with an eagle motif. Underfoot, plain leather sandals, split between comfort and affordability. A knock at the door jolts you. It's the landlady reminding you rent is due. 6 denarii this week, down from 8, but still more than you'd ever dreamed of paying 4 years ago as a naive country girl. You hand over the coins, clasp them quickly, and offer a forced smile as her shadow retreats. Bills paid, door latched, you gather your small purse, tuck it into your sash, and step into the corridor. Outside, the corridor is dim and foul, the walls stained by decades of damp. A dozen other cellars line the hallway, each with a furtive knock-knock or muffled moan issuing through half-open doors. You duck toward the stairs, flashing a polite nod to Petronia, pink-togaed and rumor-swirling, who puffs by carrying a steaming basket of clothes down to the laundromat. Above, gladiatorial shouts from the tavern floor echo through the stone. On the street, sunlight blinds you for a moment. A slave carries a tray of figs. A baker hauls sacks of barley. A senator's litter rattles by, scowling guards shoving citizens aside. You pause at the corner, smelling warm bread, fresh fish, and the ever-present stench of the Cloaca Maxima. Today's mission: the community fountain for a proper rinse, then the baths if gold and time allow. At the fountain, you join a line of at least a dozen women, children, and old men, all clutching their jugs. You splash water at your face, rinse your hands and rinse your mouth, fingers scrubbing at your teeth, before wiggling through the crowd to refill. No soap here, but natron in your pocket helps mask the smell. You fill your vessel, tuck it under your arm, and move on. Next stop, the public baths. 2 coppers at the door, plus another if you want to use the strigil and oils inside. You hand over the coins, get a small pottery token for your locker, and enter the world's most democratic social club. Merchants haggle over prices, soldiers swap war stories, and philosophers debate under dripping mosaics. You leave your things in a shallow niche, step into the tepid warm pool, and let the water loosen the aches. Steam drifts up from the hippocaust floor. Laughter echoes off the marble columns. For a fleeting moment, you're not a cellar dweller, but just another body in Rome. After scraping your skin with a curved metal blade, you reclothe, reapply perfume, rich mixtures of myrrh and oregano, and stare at the grand hall's domed ceiling, letting yourself believe you're worth more than denarii. But time calls you back to business. You emerge from the bath scented, polished, and ready to perform the most important act of all: visibility. In a city of 1 million people, anonymity is death. You step onto the street and raise your voice in greeting, your voice carrying like a bell. Good morning, gentlemen. Special price for early birds. You are on display now. The world's stage is set, and as the sun arcs high toward noon, you prepare not just to sell a service, but to tell a story with each gesture, each glance, each whispered promise. The story begins here. By midday, the streets of Rome swell with noise and heat. Bronze helmets glint under the sun, hooves clatter along cobbled roads, and the scent of roasted chickpeas mixes with sweat, perfume, and the faint rot of spoiled fish from the forum's edge. You take your place near a tavern entrance, a prime location for foot traffic, sun exposure, and visibility. Every passerby is a potential client, but also a potential threat: an angry wife, a disapproving priest, a pickpocket with fast fingers. You lean against the column, weight shifted deliberately, eyes scanning the crowd, a slight smile on your face, not too eager, not too coy. The trick isn't to look desperate, it's to look like you're always just about to be chosen. The power of suggestion is your most valuable tool. A good day means 3, maybe 4 customers. A bad day means sitting in the sun until your cheeks burn and your sandals fuse with the stones. You see familiar faces. The baker's assistant with flour still on his sleeves, the soldier with a crooked grin and fresh coin in his pouch, the senator's messenger who never looks you in the eye but always stops to chat. Small talk first, always small talk. You learn the art of listening without caring, flattering without lying, smiling without meaning. The words don't matter. It's the tone, the illusion. A client finally makes the move. He's younger than average, nervous, and reeks of boiled cabbage. But coin is coin. You lead him down the alleyway, through the narrow arch behind the tavern, into your familiar cellar. You light the lamp. You pretend the smell isn't worse today. You help him relax. You lie about how handsome he is. You close your eyes and drift somewhere far away. When it's over, he fumbles with his belt, mumbles thanks, and leaves the coin on the stool. Not enough. You gently remind him of the agreed price. He groans but pays the difference. You thank him anyway. Not for the money, but for not yelling, not hitting, not refusing. Today that counts as a good encounter. You wipe down the mattress with a damp cloth, light incense to cover the stench, and take a sip of watered down wine. You fix your makeup in the mirror, lips red again, cheeks alive again, eyes shadowed again. You smooth your wig, then you head back out, resuming your post as though nothing happened. Because nothing did. Not really. Your mind wanders as the afternoon wears on. You remember the country, before Rome, before the city swallowed your name. You had goats once, a sister, a patch of land so dry it cracked under your feet, but even dirt felt like home. Rome was supposed to be your escape, your rise. Instead, it's a stage you never leave. acting in a play you didn't audition for. The sun begins to fall, casting long shadows over the form. You decide to walk. Movement draws eyes, and walking with purpose suggests confidence. You wander past temples, bathhouses, and fountains, catching reflections in glass shop fronts and polished shields. You see yourself over and over, a woman in red, alone, visible, necessary, but never welcome. You pass a small group of matrons crossing the street, wrapped in stolas, heads high. One glances at you, then away. You recognize her. She came to you once in secret, trembling, gold ring hidden in her purse. She needed comfort. She paid double. Now she pretends not to see you. That's the game. Near the Temple of Venus, you pause, not for worship, but for traffic. The crowd here is different, wealthier, quieter, dressed in silk instead of sweat. You consider moving your operation. Higher-end clients, softer hands, fewer bruises. But with wealth comes control, contracts, houses with rules, owners instead of landlords. You'd be safer, but safety costs freedom. And freedom, even in a broken room under a tavern, still means something. As twilight sets in, the city shifts again. The vendors pack up their carts. The beggars settle near lanterns. The night market buzzes with shady merchants and whispering customers. This is your prime time. Drunk men celebrating soldiers, lonely travelers. Now is when you shine. You return to your spot near the brothel gates, where the torches flicker and the shadows stretch. The air cools, the perfumes thicken, and the city's hunger changes flavor. A group of young men swagger past, loud and reckless. One grabs your wrist. You smile tightly, slipping out of his grip. Too drunk, too violent, not worth the bruises. You back away as they stumble off. Experience teaches you when to retreat. Pride is a luxury you gave up years ago. Survival is your currency now. Another man approaches, older, dressed in a merchant's tunic. He speaks softly, offers a fair rate. You nod, lead him back. This one is gentle, talks about his wife, leaves a coin and a fig. You almost feel human for a second. Almost. Later, you sit on the edge of your bed, counting coins. 9 denarii. Enough for rent, a proper meal, maybe even a new hairpin. You allow yourself a moment of pride, not joy. Rome doesn't leave much room for that. But pride, yes. You earned your way through another day. You remove your wig, wipe off the coal and chalk. The mirror reflects your real face now. Tired, pale, lined around the mouth. You drink the last of the wine, blow out the lamp, and crawl under your scratchy blanket. The street noise fades to a dull hum. You close your eyes and think of home again. Not the room, not the city, the real home. The one that still lives in your memory. Tomorrow, it all begins again. Because Rome doesn't sleep. And neither do you. Not really. Morning again. Or at least something close to it. You're not sure whether you actually slept or just closed your eyes long enough to lose track of time. Your body aches in familiar places, lower back, hips, neck, like an old building settling. You stretch, roll your shoulders, and blink into the dim cellar light, like where everything is in exactly the same place as yesterday, down to the broken clay cup in the corner. You rise slowly, no dramatic start, no rituals, just survival. The straw mattress rustles beneath you, and a few fleas leap away like startled drunks. Your limbs are stiff, but there's no time for self-pity. You splash water on your face from the communal jug and rub your teeth with a frayed stick soaked in wine and ashes. Rome doesn't provide luxury for women like you, just tools, just enough. Out comes the chalk powder, rouge, and kohl once again. You know this face by now, how to fake vitality, how to draw attention, how to paint desire where fatigue sits deepest. The bronze mirror doesn't lie, but it doesn't care either. You add a splash of scent, something sharp and spicy, more warning than invitation. Today might be busier than most. There's a festival in the Forum, more coin in circulation, more chance of trouble. You slip into your red toga, tighten the knot, and pin it with your one good fibula. A bracelet today too, glass beads that shimmer in the right light. You need every edge you can get. There's a fresh rip in your sandal strap, but you tie it with twine and keep moving. Time is money, and you can't afford to be poor in both. On the street, the city is already alive. Musicians drum near the temples. Merchants shout about imported olives and discounted tunics. Children dart between columns with sticky fingers and no shoes. You pass a woman hawking love potions, vinegar, herbs, snake oil, promising passion, fertility, and obedience in exchange for 3 copper coins. You give her a glance. You both know you're selling the same fantasy, just packaged differently. The forum is a riot of color and noise. There's a parade forming near the Temple of Jupiter, and all around, the elite of Rome parade their wealth as if it were armor. Gold rings, embroidered tunics, even slaves with dyed hair. You stand near the edge, just visible enough to be approached, but not so prominent as to attract the attention of the wrong kind of officer. There are laws against disrupting public events. But what counts as disruption, exactly? That depends on who's watching, and how much they paid to look away. A client spots you, a middle-aged man, olive oil on his sleeves, eyes that never quite settle. He gestures, you nod. You walk together, side by side, saying nothing until you reach the shadowed alley near the tavern. He pays well, says very little, leaves quickly, the kind you prefer. He doesn't try to talk about love. He doesn't pretend you're anything other than what you are. A convenience, a passing indulgence. There's honesty in that. Afterwards, you walk toward the public latrine. Not because you need to use it, but because that's where gossip gathers. 3 other girls are already there, adjusting their wigs, fixing makeup, laughing too loudly. You join the circle. There's safety in numbers, and news travels fast here. Which guards are cracking down on unlicensed girls? Which customers are violent? Who's been arrested? Who disappeared? One of them, Livia, shows off a new bracelet, a real silver one, she claims, from a client with a merchant fleet. You smile politely and pretend not to care. Maybe it's real, maybe it's plated tin, doesn't matter. The world she lives in, the one where gifts and favors replace rent, isn't yours. You tried once, years ago, to let a man keep you. He gave you fine food and soft linens, until he found someone younger, prettier, hungrier. You left with nothing but bruises and an ulcer that still aches in the cold. The sun climbs higher and you move on. You pass a group of graffiti-scribbled walls, most of them familiar. Felicia, quick, loud, and worth the coin. Amaranta, goddess of the night, 3 denarii and you'll see stars. Some of them are about you. Crude drawings, names misspelled. You don't mind anymore. Visibility is survival. If a crude joke brings a paying customer to your door, then let them laugh. As the heat sharpens, you take shelter in a shaded arcade, drinking from your water skin. The square across from you hosts a spectacle. An amateur orator shouting about the fall of virtue in the empire, blaming foreign customs and decadent women for Rome's spiritual decay. You smirk. You've been accused of killing Rome so many times, you wonder how it's still standing. You work another client before the sun sets. This one is rougher. Not cruel, but careless. He calls you someone else's name. You don't correct him. When he leaves, you find a small cut on your thigh. Nothing serious, but it bleeds anyway. You clean it, pack it with cloth, and press your lips together until the sting passes. Evening creeps in again, and the city changes. Candles bloom behind windows, the torches flicker in alleys. The sounds shift from shouting to murmurs. The night crowd arrives, drunk, lustful, looking for something they don't dare name. You walk past a theater letting out, scanning the audience. A couple of actors blow kisses at you. You wave back. You've served some of them before. They perform in silk. You perform in linen. The stage is just smaller. You return to your brothel room to clean up and light the lamp. A knock at your door. It's Cassius, a repeat customer. Not rich, not handsome, but respectful. He brings figs sometimes. Tonight he brings a handful of almonds and a half bottle of date wine. He doesn't ask for a discount and he doesn't stay too long. After, you sit for a moment, eating the almonds slowly, savoring each one like it's a luxury feast. Because tonight it is. You count your coins again. 12 denarii today. A good day. You'll be able to buy olive oil and a new dress ribbon. Maybe even some lavender for your bath tomorrow. You make a note to visit the apothecary near the temple. He sells the good powder, the one that actually covers bruises. You remove your makeup, peel off your wig, and run your fingers through your own hair. Still damp from sweat and perfume. You stare into the mirror and practice your half smile again. This time just for yourself. Still got it. Somehow. Then you blow out the lamp and lay down. You don't expect dreams anymore, but tonight, maybe, just maybe, one will come anyway. Because in this city of gods and beasts, even the most forgotten women still dream. Dawn once again. The sky above Rome glows with that soft, dusty pink that makes the rooftops look almost gentle. You watch it from the alley, standing barefoot with your arms folded, letting the morning chill bite your skin. No clients yet, no makeup on, no voice ready for charm. Just silence for a few sacred minutes. You breathe it in. Then the city wakes up. Again. You begin your routine with practiced precision. Face powder, kohl, rouge. Each layer a kind of armor. You don't look in the mirror for long. You don't need to. You know how you're supposed to look. That face isn't yours anymore. It belongs to the job. The hair goes up in curls today. Your own, freshly oiled and stiff with smoke. And you pin them high. Add a cheap glass bead comb for flair. One of the earrings is bent, but it still catches the light. That's enough. Today, you take a new route. Not the Forum. Too noisy. Not the tavern alleys. Too many drunkards still sleeping one off. Today, you walk toward the Circus Maximus. There's a chariot race scheduled, and the streets are packed with men. Rich ones, bored ones, dangerous ones. You glide past the crowd slowly, catching eyes, giving them just a second too long to look. That's the trick. Be seen, but not caught. Not yet. A younger man follows, barely more than a boy, reeking of wine and ambition. He makes a crude joke. You smile. You've heard worse. You've said worse. He fumbles with a few coins and tries to negotiate. You tilt your head, assessing. Too young, too drunk, not worth it. Instead, you take position at a shaded colonnade near the baths. The air smells like sweat, crushed olives, and hot dust. You stand tall, chin lifted, posture alert. Two other women nearby, both wearing faded blue togas, their faces powdered like statues. You nod to each other but say nothing. Competition. But comrades too. You all know what the day demands. A customer arrives, old, wealthy, smells like sea salt and old scrolls. He wants something specific, a reenactment of a Greek myth. You don't ask which one, you say yes. He pays in advance, 6 denarii, 2 extra for silence. You guide him gently to your room, light the lamp, perform the fantasy, and lead him back out like nothing happened. You don't remember the details afterward, just his hands, dry and deliberate. You scrub them off your skin with a cloth soaked in vinegar and try not to think. That kind of client is common, smart, quiet, lonely. They treat you like a painting, beautiful, unreal, untouched by the mess they leave behind. By midday, the heat presses down like a second toga. You take refuge at a shaded fountain and count your earnings. 12 denarii already. You reward yourself with fresh bread from a vendor, still warm, crust flaking in your fingers. You eat quickly, standing, watching the world go by. Then, out of the corner of your eye, you spot her. A girl, no older than 15, nervous, makeup smudged, toga too clean, hair done too perfectly. She's new, you can always tell. She clutches the wall like it might run from her. You walk up, quietly, offer a piece of bread. She takes it with shaking hands. You don't tell her it gets better. That would be a lie. You tell her it gets easier. That's mostly true. You offer her a few names, safe clients, fair bathhouse workers, a laundress who knows how to hide bloodstains. You tell her about the midwife in the alley behind the apothecary, just in case. You tell her what you wish someone told you on your first day. Smile when you want. Say no when you can, and don't ever close your eyes with both hands tied. She nods. You both go back to your corners. The rest of the day is work. Same rhythms, same faces, same dance. A soldier who wants to talk, a merchant who doesn't, a priest who pretends not to recognize you from last week. One man asks if you have dreams. He's soft-spoken, eyes kind. You tell him you dream of fig trees and sleeping late, of warm sheets and silence, of your real name. He laughs like it's a joke. You laugh too. As night falls, the torches are lit, and Rome begins its slow descent into chaos. The wine flows, the fights start, the shadows deepen. You've made enough today, more than enough. You think of going home early, you think of sleeping, but you stay. You always stay. One last client, quiet, hands clean, a foreign accent. He pays double. You let him. After, you return to your room and stare at the ceiling. You've been in this space for 5 years. The marks on the wall are yours. The dents in the door, the scuff on the floor, all yours. You take off the wig. You wash your face with wine and water. You peel off the makeup, one layer, then another, until only your skin remains. In the mirror, you see her. The girl who left her village. The girl who thought Rome would save her. The girl who learned to survive instead. She smiles at you, not a performance, not a trick, just you, alive, still here. Outside, the city never sleeps, neither do the gods. But tonight, maybe, you will, because you've earned it, and because tomorrow, Rome will still be waiting, and so will you. They were the gatekeepers of imperial secrets, the shadows behind the silk curtains, the men who were not quite men and yet wielded more power than most full-blooded pashas. But what did they actually do when no one was watching? What do you do with time when your body has been taken, your identity rewritten, and your every waking hour spent keeping royal concubines in line? Welcome to the strangest leisure time in human history, the off-duty hours of the Ottoman eunuchs. Let's be clear, leisure here is a flexible term. When you're a castrated slave locked in a palace of gold and sorrow, downtime isn't exactly a chaise lounge and a fruity drink. It's more like surviving the suffocating quiet between orders. And yet, these men, black eunuchs from the Sudan and the Horn of Africa, white eunuchs often taken from the Balkans, found ways to fill their days, not with joy, but with survival, subtle sabotage, petty gossip, and on rare occasion, a kind of terrible peace. The harem was a world unto itself, its own society behind closed doors, wrapped in incense smoke and paranoia. Here, in the inner sanctum of the Topkapi Palace, Ottoman eunuchs were both guards and prisoners. They were the genderless custodians of the empire's most fertile assets, the concubines. Their job? To ensure no one, absolutely no one, got close to the women of the Sultan unless they had the imperial blessing, or a death wish. So when the iron doors of duty closed behind them and the Sultan's wives were sleeping or sedated or screaming into silk pillows, the eunuchs had time. Not much, but some. And what did they do with it? Let's start with the universal pastime of oppressed people throughout history. Gossip. Whispered, dangerous, glorious gossip. Eunuchs knew everything. Who snuck out, who snuck in, who bled unexpectedly, who hadn't bled at all. Who favored which perfume and who favored which poison. Their ears were sharper than their scimitars, and their tongues could kill with more precision. A well-placed whisper in the Sultan's ear, perhaps suggesting that one of the concubines was no longer pure, or that a rival eunuch had been caught speaking too freely, could change the course of palace history, or end a life, or four. Then came the writing. Yes, writing. Not every eunuch could read or write, but the elite ones, the chief black eunuch, or Kuzlar Asa, and his closest allies, were literate, and they wrote everything down. Not because they wanted to remember, but because documentation was survival. Letters, reports, coded messages to be delivered to the Grand Vizier, or burned in a brazier depending on how the wind of favor blew that day. Some eunuchs even kept journals, personal logs scribbled in Arabic script, filled with a terrifying mixture of obedience and resentment. Imagine a diary entry that reads, "Today I confiscated a love letter from a girl who couldn't write, dictated to a servant, addressed to a guard. She'll be whipped. I'll sleep easier tonight knowing I saved her from beheading." There was religion, too. Prayer was constant, especially among the black eunuchs, who were often deeply devout Muslims. 5 times a day, they bowed on worn prayer mats in the private mosques of the palace, their bodies swaying like shadows, offering their mutilated flesh up to a god they hoped still recognized them. Some turned to Sufism, seeking transcendence in mystic practices, a kind of spiritual escape from the cold geometry of the palace walls. Others fell deeper into bitter silence, repeating rote verses like broken wind-up dolls, their faith more reflex than revelation. And then, of course, there were power games. Even leisure among eunuchs was soaked in politics. Board games like Mangala weren't just time killers, they were miniature wars. Metaphors for survival in a court where everyone was watching and no one was safe. A lost game could mean more than wounded pride. It might signal weakness to an ambitious underling. So they played like generals, with quiet fury, their moves calculated down to the last pebble. Some kept birds. Yes, birds. A few eunuchs were allowed small cages tucked in their private quarters, bright green parrots, black songbirds, sometimes even falcons if they had enough favor. The birds were beautiful, colorful, untouchable things, like the women they guarded. They sang for no one, flew nowhere, also like the women, and when the birds died, they were wrapped in silk and buried like royalty, a tiny funeral for a tiny life that still deserved mourning. On rare occasions, rare like a comet or a kind sultan, eunuchs were permitted outside the palace. Escorted, of course, guarded, watched, reminded constantly that they were still property. But in the narrow alleys of Istanbul, among the crowds who didn't know their names or care about their scars, they could pretend to be real men for an hour. Buy a sweet, watch a puppet show, listen to music drifting from a tavern door and dream, for a moment, that they could enter. Most didn't. Instead, they returned early, back through the gates, back into the breathless velvet prison where silence had more weight than sound. They knew better than to long for things. In the Ottoman harem, longing was a kind of disease, and eunuchs were forbidden to be sick. Sometimes they sang, quietly, songs from home, songs from nowhere, old cracked lullabies in forgotten dialects, hummed under their breath while polishing lanterns, sewing robes, or folding the endless linens of the concubines. It was the only music allowed, and even that had to be quiet. The harem wasn't a place for melody, only for control. And sometimes they laughed, not because things were funny, but because if they didn't laugh they might break something. Themselves, maybe. The leisure of the eunuchs wasn't rest. It was a slow, sharp rehearsal for staying alive. And that was only the first half of the story. They weren't born into silk. Most Ottoman eunuchs began life far from domes and minarets, born in villages, not palaces, cradled in dust, not velvet. Many were children when they were taken, captured in wars, sold in markets, ripped from mothers whose names they would forget and who would never forget them. Some were born in the Nile's basin, others in the hills of Ethiopia or the Balkans, where snow made the fields ache with silence. Wherever they came from, they all ended up at the same knife. The castration was done quickly, efficiently, without mercy, sometimes partial, sometimes complete, always irreversible. Sometimes they lived, sometimes they didn't. Those who did were told that this was the price of greatness, the cost of being trusted near the Sultan's women, his secrets, his legacy, the price of becoming invisible yet indispensable. So what do you do with your off hours after your body has been turned into a symbol of submission? You survive, and you sharpen your mind because your body has already been claimed. Many eunuchs learned languages, Arabic, Turkish, Persian, sometimes Greek or Armenian, not out of scholarly ambition, but necessity, to interpret court gossip, to decode orders, to write reports in beautifully calligraphed Arabic that no one else in the palace would dare question. Knowledge became both their leash and their sword. Some rose to power not despite their mutilation, but because of it. They were trusted precisely because they could not reproduce. No dynasties, no threat of hereditary claim, only loyalty to the Sultan, or at least the clever illusion of it. In their rare leisure, reading was a salvation. The palace had libraries, and those who could read everything. Books on Islamic law, poetry, astronomy, herbal medicine, erotic poetry, yes, even them. The irony was thick, a man without genitals reading about love. But it wasn't about pleasure. It was about understanding how the world still worked, even when you'd been removed from it. And sometimes, yes, they wrote poetry. Sarcastic, aching, brilliant poetry that whispered from the margins of imperial life. They wrote under pseudonyms, naturally. Who'd want to read the romantic lament of a palace eunuch? But some lines survived, snuck into anthologies, stitched between verses about wine and roses. One fragment, possibly by a eunuch, reads, "She is a flame, I am the wick, but the oil was drained long ago." A sad joke, a brutal truth, possibly both. Art and poetry weren't the only distractions. There were also hobbies that hovered somewhere between ritual and rebellion. Some eunuchs grew flowers, secretly on the narrow ledges of their palace quarters. Tiny potted gardens of basil, myrtle, saffron crocuses, even narcissus. Something beautiful that wasn't bound, something alive that wanted to grow. They watered them with rationed water, spoke to them in their first languages, named them after things they'd lost. mothers, brothers, the sound of drums at sunset. And let's not forget the greatest spectator sport of the Ottoman harem, watching. Not in the way you think. No, eunuchs didn't leer. They studied every concubine, every rival eunuch, every slip of behavior. A look held too long, a servant missing for an hour, a whisper between veils. Their leisure was vigilance, their hobby, knowing what others didn't. Because in a palace of 3,000 women, power didn't come from brute force. It came from foresight, and foresight was bred in boredom. Leisure was the incubator of political genius and sabotage. When a concubine fell out of favor, was it because she became less beautiful? Or because a eunuch mentioned that her cousin had once kissed a guard behind the laundry building? When the chief white eunuch mysteriously retired to the provinces, was it his failing health? Or was it that the black eunuch had passed a note, just one, unsigned, elegantly folded, suggesting something un-Islamic about his taste in servants? Leisure meant plotting, slow, careful, invisible, no sword, just silence, and perhaps a casually dropped line to the right ear at the right time. But don't mistake them for omnipotent schemers. They were prisoners, privileged, powerful prisoners, yes, but prisoners all the same. And when the days blurred together, the walls seemed to close in, they found stranger ways to stay sane. Some invented rituals. One former eunuch reportedly bathed at exactly the same time every day, reciting the same verses while scrubbing the same arm in the same circular motion. Another polished the same copper tray for an hour each day, not because it was dirty, but because the repetition gave him control over at least something. Some talked to ghosts, literally, whispered to dead sultans, asked questions out loud, waiting for the wind to answer. You spend enough time in the same stone corridors, and even silence starts to have a voice. There were stories of eunuchs who would dress in fine robes on their day off and stand at the edge of the harem garden, not to enjoy the roses, but to be seen. A flash of crimson silk, a turned head, a reminder to the others that I may be nothing, but I still exist. And that was the hardest part, wasn't it? Existing without being allowed to be. Their names were changed, their families forgotten, their past erased, their bodies altered, their desires outlawed, their futures predetermined. So when a eunuch played a game of chess too aggressively, it wasn't about the board. When he snapped at a servant for misplacing a robe, it wasn't about the robe. When he wrote a line of poetry about the moon bleeding light into the earth, it wasn't about the moon. It was about loss, about absence, about a life spent in the margins, filling time with anything that wouldn't destroy them. And yet, somehow, they endured. Not just as ghostly figures in silk robes, but as historical forces. Several eunuchs became kingmakers. One controlled the imperial seal. Another essentially ran the empire for over a decade, while the sultan dabbled in shadow puppets and garden parties. All of this from a man who had no family, no children, and no identity outside a locked gate. Their leisure didn't relax them. It refined them into survivors, into masters of the slow burn, into men who, in their spare time, learned how to rule. There's something darkly hilarious and unspeakably tragic about the fact that some of the most powerful men in the Ottoman Empire were not technically men at all. By the standards of their society, they had been emptied, their manhood sliced off and discarded in some nameless, blood-soaked chamber far from the marble halls they would eventually haunt. And yet, these eunuchs, these surgically silenced figures, were often the ones who decided which prince lived, which concubine rose, and which enemy vanished overnight. Power and impotence hand in hand. Welcome to the cruel joke that was the life of an Ottoman eunuch. And what happens when you give that kind of man a day off? You get quiet revolutions. You get veiled threats served with tea. You get a chess match that ends with someone being reassigned to a snake-infested corner of the palace. You get bureaucratic warfare, one folded letter at a time. By the 17th century, the Kuzlar Asa, the chief black eunuch, was more than just a glorified harem guard. He was a political machine. He controlled the harem's inner workings, oversaw palace education, and even influenced who got to be Grand Vizier. He had the Sultan's ear, sometimes literally closer to it than the Sultan's own mother. And that was dangerous, not just for the empire, but for the eunuch himself. One wrong whisper, one careless alliance, and the leisure you once spent tending your potted herbs would now be enjoyed forever in the dungeons beneath the Bosphorus. So leisure became strategic, the illusion of calm. Picture this. A black eunuch sits in a garden at sunset. He holds a small book of poetry. He sips from a cup of sweetened sherbet. A junior eunuch approaches, bows, and sits at his feet. They exchange 5 words. One of those words is a name. The next morning, a concubine is gone. Just gone. It wasn't a sword. It wasn't a scream. It was leisure. It was control. It was the ability to effect change without appearing to lift a finger. And don't be fooled into thinking these were cold, sterile men. No, they felt. They felt deeply. And when no one was looking, those feelings sometimes spilled out. Some became obsessed with music, Ottoman makam pieces that twisted and wound like the palace corridors themselves. Music that didn't end, only circled. Some eunuchs learned to play instruments, quietly, privately, not for performance but for escape. An oud in the corner, a knee flute on the balcony after midnight. Their fingers might have trembled, but their melodies never did. Others turned to calligraphy, not the state-approved Quranic kind, but personal calligraphy. Letters to no one, prayers that weren't requests, just questions flung into the void. One eunuch's chamber was found, after his death, to be lined with scraps of parchment. Each bore a single word, written thousands of times in elegant ink. Remember. What was he trying to remember? Or worse, what was he afraid would be forgotten? There were more dangerous pastimes too. Forbidden books, secret meetings, occasional flings with servants, or even, rumor had it, some of the older concubines, who themselves were past childbearing age and long since abandoned by the Sultan. Was it love? Was it revenge? Was it just 2 broken things trying to become whole? We'll never know. But history, inconveniently, is littered with burned letters and vanished names. Sometimes eunuchs even indulged in one of the most forbidden of Ottoman luxuries, dreaming. Not the kind you have when you sleep, the kind you hide under your tongue like a lozenge, letting it dissolve slowly while nodding to your superiors. Dreams of escape, of real identity, of becoming more than a title and a locked door. There's an apocryphal tale about a eunuch who, in his old age, began carving tiny wooden figurines in his room. Not soldiers or sultans, but children. Dozens of them, smiling, running, holding hands. When asked about them, he said simply, "They are the lives I never made." And that's the core of the agony, isn't it? All that power, all that access, all that terrifying influence over the empire's bloodline, and no bloodline of your own. So they made their own legacies, through influence, through manipulation, through brutal, gorgeous survival. The harem was their empire, and their leisure time was their laboratory. Every hour not filled with orders became a chance to strengthen their networks, protect their position, and sometimes just breathe. You may be wondering, did they ever revolt? Oh yes, not with torches and pitchforks, but with paper and silence. Eunuchs orchestrated political purges. Some helped depose sultans. Others were behind poisonings, sudden arrests, and accidental drownings in the Bosphorus. The empire's dirty work often wore velvet slippers. In 1651, when Kosim Sultan, one of the most powerful women in Ottoman history, was strangled with her own hair by eunuchs loyal to her daughter-in-law, it was a leisure time operation. Done in the middle of the night, no fanfare, just a shift in power, choreographed like a ballet of shadows. This is what happens when you push people to the edge, strip them of everything, and then give them just enough space to think. They don't rest. They become dangerous. They master silence. They perfect patience. And in the few hours they're allowed to breathe freely, they plant the seeds of future storms. So when the sun set over Topkapi Palace, and the lamps were lit, and the concubines slipped into their silken sleep, the eunuchs didn't sleep. They planned, they remembered, they endured. Let's not kid ourselves. Survival was the real art form in the harem, and eunuchs were the reluctant Michelangelos. Every gesture, every silence, every sip of pomegranate juice had consequences. And leisure? Leisure was a luxury made of sharp edges. It wasn't rest, it was reconnaissance. Because here's the truth no history book wants to admit. The eunuchs were never truly off duty, not even at night, especially not at night. When the palace quieted and the gilded chaos of the day dissolved into candlelight, the real theater began. Whispers floated through the corridors like incense. A concubine accidentally found outside her assigned wing. A visiting ambassador who required entertainment, a scribbled message tucked into a sleeve. A eunuch always had to be two things at once, servant and spy, guardian and ghost. And while everyone else slept under silks and illusions, the eunuchs moved. Night was the one time they could drop the masks, at least a little. Some of them used the hours to write. Journals, letters to dead mothers, lists of enemies, philosophical musings that would have gotten them exiled if read aloud. Others visited each other in secret, sharing food, gossip, or just the strange comfort of being around someone else who understood what it felt like to have no past, no future, and far too much present. Sometimes they'd gamble, quietly, not for money, what would they spend it on, but for stories. Each player anteing up a scandal, a secret, a half-true rumor. The winner walked away not just richer in knowledge, but more dangerous than they'd been an hour earlier. Some went even deeper underground. Literally, beneath Topkapi Palace, there were hidden rooms and forgotten chambers, storerooms, old servant quarters, disused cisterns that echoed when you breathed. Eunuchs would gather there and speak freely in voices that didn't tremble. There, they recited poetry banned for being too political. There, they laughed at the Grand Vizier's bald spot and planned how to get their cousin reassigned from the plague-ridden outskirts of Edirne. But the most powerful pastime of all? Waiting. A black eunuch in particular, one who had risen high enough, knew that empires didn't fall in a day. They slipped, inch by inch, and if you were patient and quiet and smart, you could steer it. You could make the right introductions. You could encourage the right marriage. You could poison the right wine goblet. Not literally, well, not always, but socially, emotionally, politically. Because no one ever suspects the person without a lineage. No one ever sees the eunuch as a threat until it's far too late. Even their downtime was a trap. Invitations to tea from the Valid Sultan? Not a social call, a test. Attend too eagerly, you're a sycophant. Decline, you're disrespectful. Speak too boldly, you're arrogant. Speak too little, you're suspicious. One wrong glance and you're demoted to inventory supervisor of the palace latrine cloths. So they practiced their expressions in mirrors, smiled just so, rehearsed compliments that sounded spontaneous, learned the exact length of eye contact that implied attentiveness, not insolence. They were actors in a play that never ended and had no script, only stakes. And yet, somehow, they endured. They even found ways to live inside the cracks of the system. Some became patrons of the arts, funding tiny performances behind closed doors. Some mentored young pages, teaching them how not to die in the labyrinth of palace politics. A few even dared to find friendship, and rarer still, fragments of love. Not the poetic kind, the survival kind, the I'll cover for you kind, the if you fall I fall too kind. And when they died? When they died, they were buried in separate cemeteries, unmarried, unmourned, their names often lost, their stones marked not by lineage, but by title. Hadem Mehmed Hadem Ali Effendi, the title always first, the name always last. But look closely at the carvings. Some stones bore odd symbols, a rose with thorns, a falcon mid-flight, a chessboard. These weren't decorations, they were messages, from eunuchs to each other, from those who had no children, but left behind legacies of whispers and control. Because here's the secret. When you take away a man's future, he stops dreaming forward and starts dreaming sideways. He builds empires not through blood, but through leverage, through cunning, through mastery of the unbearable. So next time you see a painting of a eunuch standing quietly at the edge of some opulent Ottoman scene, remember, he's not just scenery. He's watching, calculating, waiting. And in the hours you thought he rested, he was planting revolutions between the cracks of your palace walls. And he will never, ever be forgotten. Because while his body was broken to serve an empire, his mind remained gloriously, lethally free. What if I told you the most cutthroat political game in the Ottoman Empire wasn't played in the Sultan's court, but behind silk curtains, embroidered pillows, and layers of rose-scented secrets? Forget the Grand Vizier, forget the Janissaries. The true masters of survival, manipulation, strategy, and psychological warfare were a group of women you've probably only heard of as the Sultan's playthings. Welcome to the harem. And no, it wasn't all lounging and feeding each other grapes. It was Game of Thrones and velvet slippers. Because what did harem women do behind closed doors? They plotted, they spied, they seduced, they wept into golden basins, they built empires out of perfume and whispered alliances. They survived. The Ottoman harem was less a place, more a world, a gilded cage of ambition, desperation, and occasionally inexplicable luxury. It was the heart of the Sultan's palace, and paradoxically its most dangerous edge. At its peak, the harem could house hundreds of women. Some were slaves, some were gifts, a few were born there, none entered voluntarily. And once you were inside, your old name, your old family, your old reality ceased to exist. You were remade, from skin to soul, to serve the house of Osman. Every woman was given a new name, usually Persian or Arabic, something exotic and soft on the tongue. But behind those elegant names were steel-trapped minds. Because make no mistake, the harem wasn't a brothel. It was a battlefield disguised as a boudoir. Let's start with daily life, not the kind that gets painted on porcelain plates, but the real stuff. Imagine waking up in a dormitory-style chamber packed with other women, all of whom would love to see you fall down a flight of marble stairs if it meant getting closer to the Sultan. You'd start your day with ritual ablutions, followed by religious instruction, music training, language lessons, and strict lessons in court etiquette. It wasn't just about being pretty, it was about being lethal, diplomatically and emotionally. You were being trained to be unforgettable. But here's the kicker, you might never even meet the Sultan, most didn't. Many women spent their entire lives behind those walls without ever so much as seeing the man whose bed they were supposedly meant for. You were essentially a contestant in a never-ending, high-stakes beauty pageant where the prize was not love, but influence. Influence over a man who controlled one of the greatest empires on earth. And the real weapon in the harem? Not beauty, not charm, fertility. The moment a concubine became pregnant with the Sultan's child, the entire dynamic shifted. She was elevated, given better quarters, more servants, and, if she bore a son, near immortality. Because a son was a potential heir, and a potential heir meant power. Real, terrifying power. Enough to make or break viziers, enough to start wars, enough to get you killed. So behind those closed doors, there were alliances between concubines, secret backroom pacts, and bitter rivalries so poisonous they make soap operas look like tea parties. Women slipped herbs into each other's drinks to induce miscarriages. Spies were planted. Gossip was weaponized. Every glance, every word was coded. An innocent question about someone's embroidery work might be a veiled threat. A compliment might be a trap. And looming above all was the Valid Sultan, the Sultan's mother, the most powerful woman in the empire, and the harem's godmother/Grand Inquisitor. If the harem was a chessboard, she was both queen and player. She controlled access to her son, she managed the budget, she decided who rose and who vanished, and she was often far more cunning than the men ruling from the divan. Some of them owed their very thrones to their mother's maneuvering. Others had their reigns shortened drastically by them. Now imagine what it's like for a new girl. Let's say you're 15, stolen from Georgia or Albania, sold by desperate parents, or captured during a raid. You arrive at Topkapi Palace terrified, illiterate, and stripped of everything you know. But you're beautiful. You catch the eye of a chamberlain, you're promoted, maybe you're given silk robes, maybe you get to serve tea to the Sultan. He smiles at you. Everyone notices. Suddenly, you're marked. The other women see you. They begin to whisper. One gives you a sweet cake. You hesitate. Is it poisoned? Another offers to braid your hair. But she pulls too hard, and you wonder, was it accidental? You're alone, surrounded by rivals who wear smiles like daggers. And you realize something. To survive here, you have to become something else. Not just obedient, not just graceful, but calculating. You start to listen more, speak less. You learn who reports to whom. You begin to keep secrets, trade favors. And when the Sultan finally calls for you, you know exactly what story you're going to tell him, because you've spent months perfecting it in the mirror. And maybe, just maybe, you leave that chamber pregnant. Now you matter. Or do you? Because now you're a threat to everyone else's ambitions. And they will come for you, gently, politely, with poisoned perfume and false sisters. You'll have to fight every single day to protect that unborn child, to ensure he lives, that he's educated, that he becomes a favorite, that he outlives his half-brothers. Because the Ottoman succession system wasn't eldest son wins. It was gladiatorial. The most competent or ruthless son took the throne, and the others, strangled with silk cords, executed, exiled, forgotten. So what did harem women do behind closed doors? They became kingmakers, survivors, puppeteers of fate. They wove tapestries of loyalty and betrayal. They turned music into espionage. They laughed and danced and played instruments, even as they plotted each other's downfalls. They bore the empire's future in their wombs and carried the weight of its cruelty in their hearts. And sometimes they just sat, quietly, alone, wondering what their real name used to be. And this is only the beginning. There's more, so much more, behind those doors. Hidden rooms, secret rituals, nighttime visits, harem rebellions. The long, slow climb of a concubine who would one day rule the empire from behind a screen. But for now, remember this. The harem was not a dream. It was a nightmare stitched in silk. And the women who lived inside it, they were not playthings. They were prisoners and queens. They say the walls of the harem had ears, but what they don't tell you is this. Those ears weren't just listening for scandal. They were collecting power. Now that we've entered the inner sanctum of the Ottoman harem, it's time to peel back even more silk. Because if you think the story was about women waiting prettily to be summoned, you're about to be pleasantly, no, violently disabused of that fantasy. The harem was not static, it was boiling, a living organism made of fear, ambition, and jasmine-scented manipulation. So what did harem women do behind closed doors? Part 2. They ruled the world, very, very quietly. Let's talk hierarchy, because nothing made the harem tick quite like it. This wasn't just concubines and wives. No. The system was a ladder slick with blood and perfume. At the bottom were the Asimis, the raw recruits, usually young girls from Eastern Europe, the Caucasus, North Africa, often war captives, slaves, or sold by families too poor to keep them. Their first stop was training. You'd be taught courtly Turkish, Quran recitation, embroidery, calligraphy, how to walk like a whisper and eat like a poem. You were transformed from terrified village girl into a creature of polish, obedience, and quiet fury. If you excelled and survived the attention of your peers, you might be elevated to carrier status. That's right, concubine. But don't clutch your pearls yet. Being a concubine in the Ottoman harem wasn't necessarily sexual. It was more like being part of a talent pool. You were one of many who might catch the Sultan's eye. Think of it as the most elaborate casting call in history, where the prize was proximity to absolute power. Catch the Sultan's interest, and you were granted a night in the imperial chamber. The stakes, higher than any reality show finale. If he forgot you, you returned to anonymity. If he remembered you, you might be invited again. If you got pregnant, the game changed entirely. You became a hasodalak, a favored concubine. From there, titles escalated like a fever dream. Iqbal, Gozda, and eventually, if the stars in womb aligned, Hasaki Sultan, the Sultan's official consort. Not a wife. Wives were rare, but a Haseki? She had influence, she had guards, she had rivals, she had enemies who were smiling at her over breakfast. Now here's where it gets especially juicy. Once a woman bore a son and she entered the most dangerous club in the palace, the mothers of princes. Because Ottoman succession was not a peaceful affair. Each prince had his own mother, his own internal court, and those mothers, oh, they played. Behind the embroidery hoops and the potted roses, these women orchestrated careers, alliances, poisonings, and love affairs, all in the name of getting their son on the throne. Because here's a fun Ottoman fact. When a new sultan came to power, his first order of business was often fratricide. That's right, strangling his own brothers with silk cords to prevent civil war. Which meant for every mother of a prince, the future held only two options. Your son becomes the sultan, or he dies in his sleep. So what did harem women do behind closed doors? They raised warriors. They whispered in princely ears. They learned politics better than the men teaching it in the madres. And while they couldn't wear swords, their tongues were sharper than any janissary blade. Let's not forget the Valid Sultan, the sultan's mother, the top of the female food chain. She didn't just run the harem, she ran the budget of the entire palace. She made diplomatic decisions. She approved or destroyed marriages, appointments, ambassadors. Foreign dignitaries had to go through her before reaching the sultan. She was statecraft in pearls and silence. The most famous of these was Kosem Sultan, a concubine turned mother turned de facto ruler. She controlled not one, but two sultans from behind a screen. When her sons were too young or too weak, she ruled as regent, issuing orders, signing edicts, and crushing rebellions. She wasn't an exception, she was a system. The era of the sultanate of women lasted nearly a century, and you thought the harem was all cushions and flutes. But ruling wasn't the only thing happening behind those doors. The harem was also a culture machine, a pressure cooker of art, literature, and madness. Women wrote poetry that was passed secretly between chambers, some of it devotional, some of it scandalously erotic. Others painted miniatures that mocked the eunuchs and praised forbidden love. There were harem dramas, actual theatrical performances acted out in private for each other, laced with satire so sharp you'd think Oscar Wilde was hiding behind the curtains. And sometimes these women just broke. The constant surveillance, the silent competition, the possibility that any food, any cup of sherbet might be your last. It cracked people. Some women lost their minds, walking the halls muttering to themselves, speaking to invisible suns. Others tried to escape, not the palace, but themselves. Drugs were present, opium, hashish, not common, but not unheard of. It dulled the despair. Still others found strange ways to rebel, secret romances with guards, illicit correspondence with foreign visitors. One woman, they say, trained a nightingale to carry messages to a sailor docked in Istanbul's harbor. The bird was caught, the woman vanished, and then there were the small acts of resistance, a concubine refusing to bow deeply enough, a knowing glance exchanged across a ceremonial dinner, a song sung just out of tune with lyrics that meant something far more dangerous than they appeared. These weren't mistakes, they were code. They were rebellion in slow motion. Because you couldn't scream in the harem, you couldn't flee, you couldn't stab your rival in the back, not literally anyway, but you could outmaneuver her, you could win the long game, and many did. Some harem women didn't just survive, they thrived. They became architects of their own weird fates. They created mini empires within the empire, commanding the loyalty of servants, eunuchs, and even viziers. They secured wealth for their families back home. They negotiated marriages for their daughters. Yes, some were allowed to marry out. They became legends even as their names were erased from official records. And through it all, they played their parts, smiling, bowing, dancing, offering fruit from gilded trays, while quietly rearranging the structure of Ottoman power beneath everyone's feet. Behind those velvet doors, behind the hush and the veils, history was being written by women who weren't even supposed to exist. And next, in part 3, we'll descend into the real scandals, forbidden love, betrayal, assassination, ghosts, curses, and the single most outrageous rebellion in harem history. Because the walls weren't just listening anymore, they were whispering back. Let's stop pretending the harem was a quiet place. By the time we get to the heart of this nightmare in silk, the whispers behind the doors have turned into claws. The dance is done, the masks are off. Welcome to part 3. Where love gets dangerous, loyalty dissolves, and the harem stops playing nice. Because if you thought these women were too refined to fight, think again. They didn't just break rules. Sometimes they burned the whole velvet wrap system down. Let's start with forbidden love, the kind that gets you killed, literally. Despite being surrounded by women, eunuchs, and protocol, affairs did happen. And when they did, the fallout was operatic. Some concubines dared to fall in love with palace guards. And some of those guards were dumb enough, or lovesick enough, to write letters, smuggle gifts, or even try to sneak into the harem chambers at night. One story tells of a young concubine who arranged nighttime meetings with a musician, an oud player. When they were caught, he was strangled with his own instrument strings, and she was sewn into a leather sack and thrown into the Bosphorus. Romantic? No. Of course, it wasn't always love. Sometimes it was political seduction. A concubine might sleep with a vizier or bribe a eunuch to gain access to forbidden knowledge, secret letters, or even poisons. One whispered story from the mid-17th century tells of a favorite of the Sultan who fell in love with a Venetian ambassador. Yes, really. The harem's elite found out. She was removed so quietly that no one even remembered her name a month later. A ghost in perfume. And ghosts, by the way, were a problem. Palace superstition ran deep. The harem was full of them. Late at night, women reported seeing the figures of long-dead favorites. Those who had died in childbirth, in jealousy-fueled fights, or under suspicious circumstances. Some claimed to hear crying from empty chambers. Others swore the fountain in the center of the harem courtyard ran red with blood on the anniversary of a major execution. Were these hallucinations? Echoes of trauma? Or maybe just the guilt of too many silenced rivals? Either way, paranoia fed the madness, and madness fed rebellion. Let's talk about the most unhinged moment in harem history, the Kadınlar İsyanı, or Women's Rebellion. You haven't heard of it? That's because most textbooks don't cover the day the harem nearly exploded. It happened during the reign of Sultan Ibrahim, yes, the famously unstable one, known as Ibrahim the Mad. His obsessions with women, furs, and fish, don't ask, were already straining the court. But when he began promoting low-status concubines and ordering bizarre rituals, things broke. A group of concubines, dozens of them, refused to perform his increasingly humiliating demands. They went on strike, a harem strike. They locked themselves in the chambers, refused to bathe, refused to dress, refused to appear. The Sultan lost his mind. He ordered food to be cut off. Eunuchs were sent in to physically drag them out. Fights broke out. Lamps were thrown. Silk curtains set on fire. Some women were beaten. One died, but the rest? They held out for days. Eventually, the Valid Sultan had to intervene, calming the Sultan and restoring order, but the damage was done. This was no longer a hidden world of submission. It was a pressure cooker, and it had burst. Now, let's not forget the eunuchs, the black-robed, silent sentinels who controlled the gates of the harem. Officially, they were loyal servants. Unofficially, power brokers. They had their own factions. The chief black eunuch, Kuzlar Asa, wielded incredible political power, often more than a vizier. Some eunuchs allied with concubines, tipping off favorites about court intrigues. Others spied for the sultan's mother or sold secrets to the highest bidder. Some even ruled, not publicly, but from the shadows. One eunuch, Hacha Mustafa A'a, was said to have held enough dirt on half the court to have them executed with a nod. He never had to say a word. His silence was his power. And when he died, some claimed his chamber was filled with chests of gold and scrolls full of secrets locked behind wax seals. Of course, the records deny any of this ever happened. Speaking of secrecy, let's talk execution. No harem story is complete without a good old-fashioned off with her head, except in the Ottoman tradition it was far more elegant. Silk cord, no blood, no spectacle. One moment you're being served quince jelly by a girl named Aishi. The next, Aishi is gone. Her belongings packed up. Her name never spoken again. Execution wasn't always about betrayal either. Sometimes it was politics, or simply being inconvenient. You didn't need to do anything wrong, just be in the wrong room when the Sultan changed his mind. This is where the terrifying reality sets in. Harem women lived, knowing that any misstep, any wrong smile, any ill-timed pregnancy, any rumor could mean disappearance. So they clung to what little they could control. Fashion, etiquette, gossip. One's appearance in the harem was part armor, part advertisement. The best-dressed women weren't just pretty, they were dangerous. Their embroidery spoke in code. Their hair was styled with hidden meanings. A color worn at the wrong time could signal support for a rival or sympathy for an enemy. And don't get us started on sherbet politics. Yes, sherbet. The flavor of the drink served at celebrations could send messages. Rosewater meant contentment. Cherry meant ambition. Lemon, caution or mourning or revenge. But even more powerful than clothing or sherbet was storytelling. Harem women told stories to each other constantly. Fairy tales, legends, personal histories rewritten as myth. These weren't just for entertainment, they were training. An oral code of survival passed from older concubines to younger ones. A way of reminding each other, you are not the first to bleed in silk. You will not be the last. Here is how we do it. Here is how we hide the pain. Here is how we win, and some did win. Some women walked out of the harem, not many, but a few. Married off to pashas or governors as political tokens, they left the palace with gold, property, and most importantly, stories. Others lived long enough to see their sons become sultans and themselves crowned as valid sultans, and some simply survived. They outlived their rivals, their enemies, the sultan himself. They watched empires rise and fall from behind carved lattice windows, and they remembered. Because survival in the harem wasn't just about living, it was about remembering who you were before the palace erased you, before the perfumes and protocols turned you into a ghost in human form. And if you think this was the peak of absurdity, just wait for part 4, because next, we go deeper, into the secret schools, the ghostly rituals, the punishments so bizarre they sound like fever dreams. And finally, the harem's slow, brutal collapse, because even the most dangerous dream eventually wakes up. They say empires fall with a roar. The Ottoman harem? It fell with a sigh, soft, perfumed, and nearly invisible. But don't be fooled. Behind that sigh was centuries of suffocated ambition, broken bodies, and whispered names that echoed through walls no longer standing. This is the end. The final act. The slow-motion collapse of the most powerful and most misunderstood institution of women in imperial history. By the 18th century, the Ottoman harem had transformed. The golden age of deadly court intrigue, poisonings, silk strangulations, and seductive warfare had begun to wither, but not because the women became any less brilliant or dangerous. No, because the system itself began to rot from within. Start with the sultans. The once dreaded semi-divine rulers had started to soften, to lose the terrifying clarity that made their ancestors feared from Vienna to Yemen. Many were increasingly cut off from the world, raised in isolation, some literally locked in gilded cages, the infamous cafes. They came to the throne untested, emotionally stunted, and deeply paranoid. That made them easier to manipulate, but also more unstable. And with unstable men on the throne came unstable power in the harem. The women no longer knew how to play the game. The rules had changed. Where once a concubine could rely on seduction, lineage, or sheer cunning, now she was navigating a labyrinth filled with spoiled boy rulers who had never even led an army or seen a battlefield. Try charming a sultan who thinks the world ends at the edge of his velvet cushions and only cares about parrots and opium. The valid sultan, once the queen of this internal kingdom, began to lose her grip too. Her influence was still feared, but now she was often sidelined by new ministers, European-style bureaucrats, and a rapidly modernizing palace staff. Diplomacy replaced manipulation, money replaced whispers. Everything got duller, and far more dangerous. And yet, the women still resisted, just differently. Gone were the dramatic showdowns and hair-pulling fights in the bathing chambers. Instead, there were cold silences, poison replaced by rumor, exile by neglect. New concubines were often barely trained. Some didn't even speak the language of the court, and the exotic cosmopolitanism of the harem began to feel more like a refugee camp than a finishing school. But one final horror still remained. The sultan's heirs were still killing each other. Yes, even as late as the 19th century, sons were sometimes still quietly eliminated, not always with silk cords anymore, but with accidents, mysterious illnesses, convenient reassignment to plague-ridden provinces. The harem mothers lived in constant fear that the son they raised, so carefully, so ruthlessly, would be the next forgotten name in a dusty imperial register. And there were still secret rituals. There are accounts, heavily disputed of course, of midnight purity inspections, old traditions from darker centuries lingering in secret, of women being lined up, dressed identically, and inspected by the chief eunuch or the sultan himself under the flickering light of lanterns. Some say there were still secret baths held on holy days, where women would scrub their bodies raw in ritual purification, praying to be chosen. Others say the prayers stopped being hopeful centuries ago. Then came the outsiders, European ambassadors, foreign wives, curious journalists. They peered into the palace with monocles and notebooks, writing about laziness, decadence, and oriental sloth, as if the women inside were just lounging about doing nothing. They didn't understand that the harem had never been about leisure. It had been about survival. And now, stripped of power, the women weren't lounging. They were grieving. Some began to write. Yes, really, memoirs, letters, secret diaries. A few brave or bitter women who had been cast out of the harem began to tell their stories. Many were dismissed as scandalous fiction, but some cut a little too close to the truth. They wrote about the girls who disappeared, the bribes that changed destinies, the eunuchs who played gods, the time the sultan slapped a concubine for laughing too loud, the day the Valid sultan collapsed in her garden after hearing of her son's death, and no one dared approach her for hours. They wrote about empty corridors echoing with ghost laughter, of perfume that lingered for years after its wearer had been buried, of the fountains in the harem courtyard, once flowing with water, now dry and cracked like forgotten mouths. By the time the 20th century arrived, the harem had become a shadow of its former self. The empire itself was staggering. Revolution brewed. Young Turks with suits and rifles replaced old men with robes and beads. Westernization began swallowing everything. The caliphate was abolished, the monarchy dismantled, and the harem, it was emptied. In 1924, the last official women of the harem were evicted, sent away, given small pensions. Some returned to distant villages they had been stolen from as children. Others wandered aimlessly, stripped of their titles, identities, even their names. Top Kappa Palace, once the living, breathing organism of Ottoman rule, fell silent. The marble floors that had once echoed with slippered footsteps now creaked under the boots of tourists. The lattice screens that had once hidden the eyes of the most powerful women in the world now framed selfie sticks. And yet, something lingers. You can still smell the rose oil if you stand in the right corner. You can still feel the weight of 1,000 unspoken prayers pressed into the silk cushions. You can almost hear the stories that were never written, whispered between girls who knew they might not live to see 30. So, what did Ottoman harem women do behind closed doors? They clawed their way through nightmare after nightmare, in rooms gilded with lies. They fought invisible wars with smiles. They wove love, grief, and survival into a single glance. They outlived emperors. They outwitted viziers. And then, quietly, they were erased, but not forgotten. Because behind those locked doors, behind the scandals and myths, behind every scented room and silenced voice, there lived an empire made of women, and it never stopped watching. What if your 9-to-5 job involved stretching people on racks, boiling their feet in oil and casually removing fingernails while a bishop looked on approvingly? Now imagine clocking out after all that and trying to decide whether to have wine with dinner or go fishing. Welcome to the Renaissance, a time of humanism, classical revival, and government-sponsored agony. But hey, even professional torturers needed a day off. The real question is, what in God's twisted name did they do with their free time? Because, let's be honest, what kind of hobbies does a man have after spending his week hanging people by their armpits? The answer is just as bizarre and deeply uncomfortable as you might think. In Renaissance Europe, the torturer, known in many cities as the Mastro di Giustizia, or Master of Justice, was a paradox in flesh. On one hand, he was feared, loathed, and avoided like the plague, sometimes quite literally. On the other, he was a necessary cog in the beautiful machine of order. Someone had to make criminals confess, heretics repent, witches burn, and preferably it needed to be done without staining the bishop's nice gloves. But when he wasn't busy force-feeding someone hot lead or cranking a heretic's joints out of socket, the torturer had free time. And in those hours, between confessions and executions, he was expected to live like a normal man, which is hilarious, because his entire existence was the opposite of normal. Let's start with something relatively tame. Errands. Yes, errands. Torturers were typically not rich. Their salaries were modest, often paid by the town council or ecclesiastical authorities. Many supplemented their income by doing side work, pulling teeth, performing minor surgeries, or disposing of plague bodies. So on his day off, our friendly neighborhood inquisitor might be out in the marketplace, haggling for onions while villagers pretended not to notice the bloodstains on his apron. Children would run away, women would cross themselves, merchants would try not to make eye contact, and still, the torturer would need to buy his bread like anyone else. He might even try to chat about the weather, which, for a man who spent most of his days underground in cold stone chambers, was probably just a confusing rumor. But errands weren't enough. Like any man, he needed entertainment. So what did he do for fun? Well, let's talk about sports. Renaissance torturers were often required to be physically strong enough to tie someone up with ropes, hoist heavy iron devices, or restrain thrashing bodies. The strength needed to be maintained, so some practiced a kind of grotesque version of self-care, lifting weights, often repurposed shackles, stretching, not unlike their victims, but consensual, and sparring with other guards. Yes, sparring. Swordplay, quarterstaffs, even wrestling were common among men in official positions. Torturers didn't just need to hurt people, they needed to survive angry mobs, revenge-driven relatives, or even political assassins sent by rival factions. Physical conditioning was as much about survival as it was about entertainment. But let's not pretend they were all disciplined. Many torturers, historically, were drunks, and not quiet, sipping from a tankard in the corner drunks. We're talking about full-blown, brawling, glass-shattering alcoholics, because if your job involves screaming, blood, fire, and bone, then yeah, you're probably not going to unwind with herbal tea and a lute solo. Taverns were one of the few places where torturers could semi-blend in. Though again, blending in might mean having your own permanent stool and your ale served with trembling hands. Some taverns outright banned them, fearing bad luck, fights, or even curses. Others embraced the notoriety. There are reports of bars in Italy and Spain that catered specifically to legal professionals, offering discount drinks to executioners and their assistants. That's right, happy hour for people who just dislocated someone's shoulder until they confessed to witchcraft. And what about love? This is where things get complex. Torturers were often forbidden from marrying regular townsfolk. In many cities, their entire families were considered infamosia, a kind of hereditary shame. Their children couldn't enter guilds. Their wives were whispered about in markets. Some towns even had special districts for unclean professionals like gravediggers, lepers, and torturers. So romantic prospects were limited. Some married other social outcasts, widows, prostitutes, criminals. Others remained celibate, either by choice or by sheer lack of opportunity. But there are rare accounts of torturers marrying women who admired their power, or who saw in them a kind of brutal stability. And then there were the truly unsettling relationships, where a torturer's partner had once been his victim. Yes, it happened. Sometimes confessed witches or heretics, once spared, were married to their interrogators as part of a perverse reward system. Picture your torturer proposing after he lets you keep your toes. But let's leave the romance for now. It's making everyone uncomfortable. Let's move on to something equally disturbing, hobbies. Believe it or not, torturers had them. Some were into carving, often bones. Others made their own instruments, crafting iron devices with almost artistic flair. Some collected body parts, others kept diaries. One German torturer in the 1500s was known for writing poetry about death, punishment, and how unfairly he was treated by society. He wanted to be seen as a man of intellect, not just an agent of agony. Spoiler, history disagreed. And then there were the animals, dogs mostly. Torturers often kept large dogs, both for protection and companionship. There's something heartbreakingly ironic about a man who could flay a prisoner alive weeping when his mastiff caught a fever. But it happened. One documented case from Nuremberg tells of a torturer who refused to work for 3 days after his dog died, saying he couldn't focus while my heart remains torn. Yes, dear viewer, even monsters have soft spots, which just makes them more horrifying somehow. The line between work and life was never clear for these men. How could it be? Pain was their profession, and pain, once learned that intimately, never leaves. Many torturers suffered nightmares. Some had religious hallucinations. Some turned to confession. Others avoided churches entirely, afraid perhaps that God was real and very, very angry. They lived in limbo, feared by the people they protected, resented by the courts they served, stuck in a moral no man's land where justice and cruelty danced like lovers in the dark. And on their days off, they drank, they brooded, they trained, they tried badly to be human. But mostly, they waited for the next knock at their door, the next body, the next scream, because no matter how much wine they drank, or dogs they loved, or furniture they carved, they were never just men. They were instruments, and instruments don't get days off, only silence. Until the next scream breaks it. Let's talk about Sundays. In theory, it was the day of rest. In practice, it was the day you pretended you weren't a professional bringer of screams. Some torturers tried to attend mass, but nothing kills the sacred atmosphere faster than a man kneeling in the pews with a blood-stained fingernail still clinging to his boot. People shuffled away, priests rushed their sermons, children stared, and the torturer, trying to look devout, sat there like a meat cleaver in a basket of bread rolls. But here's the twisted part. Sometimes they were required to attend. Civic ritual, proof of morality, public display of humility. Nothing says spiritual redemption like having your town's iron-fisted interrogator singing hymns next to the butcher's wife. It was performative piety at its most absurd. After all, what's a little prayer after a week of hammering through rib cages? But if Sunday was supposed to cleanse the soul, it often only sharpened the blade. Because what did a torturer actually think about in church? Not salvation, not sin. No, he was inventorying, calculating how many thumbscrews needed replacing, wondering if the rack's rope had started fraying, replaying the last confession line by line to see if it had been a lie. And above all, he was watching the congregation, looking for trembling hands, darting eyes, whispered gossip. Church was not just about God, it was about intel. Because in Renaissance Europe, almost everyone had something to hide, and the torturer was the man hired to dig it up. But Sundays weren't all church and staring contests. There was also theater. Yes, theater. It might sound ridiculous, but public executions were considered entertainment, and the torturer was the lead actor. He had to know how to play the crowd. Too fast and people felt cheated, too slow and they booed, too much screaming and they vomited, not enough screaming and they accused you of using sorcery. So when they weren't working, some torturers went to actual theaters to watch. Some went for inspiration, others went to learn how to perform better. There are accounts of torturers studying traveling actors and even taking notes on how to project their voices or gesture dramatically before a crowd. Why? Because if you're going to burn someone at the stake, you might as well give the people a show. In their off hours, some even practiced monologues. Imagine it, a man who spent the week with hot irons rehearsing lines from Seneca, or pretending to be Julius Caesar, not because he cared about Rome, but because pretending to be someone else, anyone else, was the closest thing he had to freedom. But let's pivot to something darker. You may be wondering, were torturers ever tortured themselves? Oh yes, just not physically. Their torment was existential. Many lived in a permanent state of paranoia. What if the Duke fell out of favor? What if a merchant's son died too soon under questioning? What if a rival torturer spread a rumor that you'd botched an interrogation? One bad week and you could go from iron wielder to iron worn. That's why many torturers developed elaborate rituals of superstition. Lucky charms, blessed amulets, saints' bones sewn into their clothing. Some even refused to sleep near mirrors, believing the souls of the condemned might try to return through reflections. Some avoided eating meat on Mondays, others buried fingernail clippings under specific trees. One legendary Spanish torturer refused to say the word truth unless he was barefoot. Not for any theological reason, just vibes. They were walking bundles of ritual, habit, and barely suppressed panic. Because in a world where law was as stable as soggy parchment, your only real safety came from being useful and forgettable. But not all of them were paranoid. Some leaned in. Let's talk about artistry, because some of them were proud of their craft. There are disturbing reports of torturers creating personal manuals, illustrated ones, with notes like, "This method works best on thin men," or "Avoid use on pregnant women, causes complications." They treated pain like science, a discipline, a bloody, squealing form of anatomical choreography. They experimented, some created their own devices, variants of the rack, customized thumbscrews. One infamous Italian torturer invented something called the whisperer, a small brass instrument inserted into the ear canal while heated, meant to simulate divine voices. It didn't extract confessions, it just drove people mad. But it earned him a commendation from the local bishop. Yes, dear viewer, the Renaissance was a strange time, a time when men who could barely spell were granted state funding to reinvent the concept of screaming. But you're probably wondering, did any of them regret it? Here's where things get murky. Some torturers retired, moved to the countryside, took up gardening, lived out their days pruning grapes and hoping no one remembered the smell of burning hair. A few even entered monasteries, trying to drown the shrieking ghosts in chants and candle wax. But most just kept going. Because once you've tortured for 10, 15, 20 years, what else are you good for? What employer is going to look at your resume and say, "Oh, excellent, you're great at creative screaming and basic dental work, perfect for our bakery"? They were lifers, not because they loved it, but because it was the only thing they could do, the only thing society allowed them to do. And in this grotesque job security, there was something tragic, something human. They weren't cartoon villains. They weren't always sadists. Some were, but many were just trapped in a system that required cruelty and punished conscience. So what did Renaissance torturers do on their days off? They drank, they watched plays, they trained, they prayed, they brooded, they carved grotesque figurines from leftover bone, they whispered to dogs, they practiced fake smiles in cracked mirrors, and then they returned to work, quietly, methodically, professionally, because no matter what they did with their time off, one thing was always true. The pain never really left. It was etched into them, like soot in stone, like iron in the blood, and they carried it with them, every hour, every day, every scream, even in silence. Let's say it's Wednesday morning. The torture chamber is quiet for once. Nobody's dislocated, no one's confessing. The ropes hang limp, the brazier is cold. So what does the state-sanctioned pain artist do? He goes shopping. Yes, really. Torturers had errands, boots to resole, gloves to repair, chains to replace. Inquisitorial budgets didn't cover everything, and tools broke, especially when they were wrapped around heretics. So they walked through marketplaces like grim celebrities. Vendors would pretend not to see them, or worse, pretend to like them. "Ah, Master Gallo, more oil for your Iron Maiden? Excellent vintage this year." Some sellers would throw in extra grease, not out of kindness, but fear. A free duck here, a discounted leather strap there, because no one wants to haggle with the man who flays for a living. Others whispered behind his back, called him the screech collector, sane iron hands, or simply that one. But they'd never say it to his face. Of course, some torturers leaned into this aura, wore their profession like a crown of worms. One German torturer wore a black velvet cloak, even on summer days, just to increase suspense. Another in Florence commissioned a silver ring shaped like a screaming face and wore it while eating. At dinner parties. Ah, yes, dinner parties. You didn't think they skipped those, did you? The Renaissance elite loved their grotesque, and nothing made for a better conversation piece than a royal torturer slouched next to the court astrologer, sipping mulled wine and silently judging your posture. "Tell me, Signore Bianchi," a duchess would whisper, tipsy on spiced mead, "is it true what they say about your thumb press?" To which Bianchi, full of roasted boar and quiet contempt, would reply, "Only if the suspect is right-handed, milady." Hus, bufin, laughter. Cue awkward silence. Cue everyone realizing, dear God, he's not joking. These social gatherings were theater, but dangerous ones. Torturers were tools, but tools given a face, a place at the table. And everyone knew that one bad joke, one wrong anecdote, and you might find yourself in the chamber instead of chatting about it over pheasant stew. Some torturers hated these events, the hypocrisy, the perfume, the false smiles. One reportedly excused himself from a banquet by claiming his bones ached from all the honesty in the room. He was not invited back, so where else did they go? Some went to brothels, a subject both taboo and predictable. But here's where things get disturbingly Renaissance. Certain brothels offered themed experiences. You heard that right, torture-themed liaisons. Nothing permanent, nothing damaging, just roleplay. Just enough pain to tickle the memory of sin without crossing into damnation. It was a parody of power. The torturer, who controlled the lives of hundreds, could finally play the fool, the servant, the one without control. It was escapism, pathetic, human, and oddly, sad. Others sought out artists. Yes, there were Renaissance painters who secretly sketched torturers, not just for anatomy studies, though that was part of it, but because there was a fascination with the faces of Paine's architects. One particularly macabre notebook, attributed to a minor Venetian draftsman, shows 17 side profiles of known executioners and torturers. Each one is labeled not by name, but by method. The man who boiled, the jointer, red rope, silent rope, teeth. The sketches are beautiful, haunting. All the men have distant eyes, as if they've already left the world behind, or never fully entered it in the first place. But the real question is, did they ever laugh? Yes, just not like you or me. Their humor was specific. They told jokes about confessions gone wrong, about nobles who screamed before the iron even touched them, about priests who refused to name names until the pliers came out. One torturer reportedly trained a raven to mimic the word mercy. He thought it was hilarious. The bird would call, "Mercy, mercy," from the rafters whenever someone entered the chamber, even when it was empty, especially then. Another carved crude caricatures of bishops into blocks of soap, then melted them, over and over, a private ritual, a petty revenge. No one dared ask why. And some jokes were written, marginalia and court records, scribbled in the corners where no one was supposed to look. Tiny doodles of dismembered lawyers, notes like, subjects saying better than choir boy, should hire for Easter Mass, or, bit me, recommend jaw removal next time. These weren't jokes to make friends, they were coping mechanisms. Laughter as armor, sarcasm to drown out the screams that never really left the ears. But not everything was grim. Some torturers had hobbies. One grew roses, beautiful, delicate, blood-red roses that locals swore never wilted. Another played the lute, badly. He'd sit by the window of his tiny apartment playing dirges off-key while his neighbors tried desperately to pretend the man upstairs hadn't just crushed someone's knee with a crank. And some wrote poetry, dark, broken, rhymeless poetry, fragments of guilt wrapped in metaphor. We know this because a handful of these verses survived, usually unsigned, scribbled onto parchment scraps found under floorboards or sewn into pillow stuffing. One reads, "I twist, I tear, I question deep, but it's my own sleep I cannot keep." Another, "They scream the truth I do not seek, for mine is buried, dark and weak." Were these men monsters or mirrors? The Renaissance didn't care. As long as the rack turned, the candles burned, and heretics confessed, no one asked if the man holding the tools was still a man at all. And so, on their days off, these architects of agony wandered marketplaces, kissed saints' relics, fed ravens, and tried, desperately, to feel something that wasn't just noise or blood. Because when your job is to destroy the human spirit, your biggest fear is realizing you've destroyed your own. Eventually, even the most hardened torturer puts down the iron tongs and wonders, was it worth it? Because here's the secret that history rarely whispers. Torturers didn't live long, and when they did, they didn't live well. After the screams faded, after the flesh cooled and the confessions were signed in blood, what remained was a silence so thick it swallowed thoughts. Retirement, if you could call it that, was not a parade of golden chalices and grateful kings. It was a slow fade into fear, suspicion, and rot. You see, the Renaissance courts were transactional. You were useful until you weren't. Torturers were feared, yes. Respected? Rarely. Loved? Never. And as regimes changed, as popes died, dukes were poisoned, republics fell. The men who twisted limbs and pulled teeth were often the first to go. They knew too much. They'd seen too much. They had too many names burned into their memories. Many were retired via mysterious illnesses, sudden drownings, fire accidents. One torturer in Bologna was found dead in his wine barrel, a grape press lodged in his chest. Suicide, they said. No one laughed. Others were simply cast aside. There's a heartbreaking account of a Spanish interrogator begging a local bishop for work after his services were no longer needed. He was denied and told to seek Christ, not coin. He died alone in a monastery stable. The horses reportedly refused to enter the stall for weeks afterward. But let's rewind. What about the lucky ones? The ones who weren't murdered, exiled, or driven mad? Some fled to the countryside, took up farming, grew onions and garlic in silence, avoided churches. One lived in a windmill and was said to never sleep at night. Children dared each other to knock on his door. None ever did. Others became consultants. That's right, traveling from court to court, teaching enhanced interrogation techniques to eager apprentices. The Renaissance, for all its genius, was a golden age of sadism and bureaucratic clothing. They held secret seminars for judges and clerics. How to identify lies, how to apply just enough pain, how to keep a man alive through 7 hours of agony. One surviving document is titled On the Preservation of Life During Interrogation, a cheery little pamphlet full of diagrams and moral disclaimers. It reads like a medical manual written by a demon, but even knowledge has its limits, because no matter how skilled the torturer, the world changed. The Enlightenment dawned, dragging justice out of the Dark Ages. Philosophers began whispering dangerous things like human dignity and inherent rights. Even kings started flinching at the sight of the rack, and soon torture became unseemly, old-fashioned, embarrassing. So the torturers vanished. Some changed names, some fled overseas. One moved to Amsterdam and became a bookseller. He specialized in religious texts, though none could explain why every book in his shop was locked with a tiny iron clasp. Their chambers were sealed, their tools melted down, their journals burned, but not all. A few relics remain. There's a pair of thumbscrews in a museum in Prague, a branding iron in Venice, a blood-stained chair in the Tower of London that no one cleans. Because when they tried, the cleaner claimed she heard someone whisper her mother's name from the wood. These objects sit behind glass now, safe, sterile, interpreted, but do not mistake their silence for peace. Because behind every display case lies a truth we refuse to look at directly. Someone once chose to make this. Someone oiled that leather. Someone measured that spike. Someone practiced the timing of screams like a maestro tuning a violin. And when they weren't torturing, they lived, not in some ghoulish cave, not in a blood-soaked dungeon, but in apartments, farmhouses, rented rooms above apothecaries. They argued with their spouses, burned their soup, fed stray cats, collected taxes, laughed at crude jokes, lamented the weather. They were us. That's the part no one wants to admit. Torturers weren't monsters in skin. They were people who made peace with horror. They compartmentalized, they moralized, they built justifications as intricate as their torture devices. Better one suffer than 10 die. The truth must be protected. Pain purifies. I was only doing my job. They believed it. Some even went to confession, weekly. But when the doors closed and they were alone with their thoughts, no victim chained, no inquisitor watching, they sometimes cracked. There are tales of torturers who screamed in their sleep for years, of those who clawed at their own skin as if trying to peel something off that wasn't visible, of one who, when finally asked by a priest what hell looked like, whispered, "It has my hands, but not my eyes." In the end, what did Renaissance torturers do on their days off? They tried to forget. They trimmed hedges, brewed beer, read psalms, played with their dogs, avoided looking into mirrors, sat in the sun and tried to feel warm without remembering the fires they had lit in darker rooms. And when they died, quietly, messily, or violently, history politely turned the page. Because it's easier to talk about the genius of Da Vinci than the man who slowly skinned a heretic in the next street over while the bells rang for mass. But if you listen carefully, beneath the violins and frescoes and golden light of the Renaissance, you'll still hear it, a scream, echoing, shaped like a question no one once answered.